These days, pretty much every professional wrestler in the world tells you everything they do with themselves every single hour of every single day via podcasts, social media, and other online content. It wasn't always this way, and there are plenty of documented instances of wrestlers back in the day taking incredible steps to make sure they stayed in character. And it didn't matter if it cost them kudos or a booking, landed them in jail, or otherwise made their life more difficult than it needed to be. I'm Adam Pachisi from Cultaholic Wrestling, and this is 10 times pro wrestlers refuse to break character. Join us. Number 10, the Sandman plays a blinder. In the main event of the October 4th, 1994 episode of ECW Hardcore TV, Tommy Dreamer and the Sandman collided in an I Quit match. The finish saw Tommy accidentally push a lit cigarette into his opponent's eye, with the Sandman being rushed out of the arena as members of the locker room chastised an apologetic Dreamer. ECW presented the angle as a shoot and announced that the Sandman had been blinded and would have to retire from the wrestling business. To maintain the illusion, James Fullington barely left his own house for an entire month, insisting on his wife Laurie answering the door and telephone. When he did need to venture outside, he made sure he wore bandages over his eyes and had somebody with him to help him around. This was deemed essential by the beer-drinking cane swinger as he lived in ECW's home base of Philadelphia. He was finally able to drop the act when it was revealed that the whole thing was, in fact, a ruse at November to Remember. Because of his dedication to convincing people that he was actually blind, there was genuine shock at the Sandman's reveal. Number 9, the jury's out on Bray Wyatt. After the main roster failure of Nexus member Husky Harris, Wyndham Rotunda decided he was going all in on his next character, Bray Wyatt. As Wyndham told John Robinson for his book NXT The Future Is Now, he became obsessed with figuring out who Bray was, and thanks to a close working relationship with Dusty Rhodes, began to lose his mind while getting into the character. This extended to when Rotunda was called in for jury duty in his hometown, with the American Dream convincing him to show up in full gimmick. And that is something that Wyndham, or should I say Bray, actually did, wearing a Hawaiian shirt, white pants, and a straw hat. Rhodes felt it would be a good exercise for Wyatt, who noted that he didn't break character once during the process. Needless to say, he didn't end up being selected for jury duty. Regardless, this dedication to keeping character outside the ring would serve Bray well over the course of his career, as he retained his unique aura thanks in large part to his reluctance to peel back the curtain. Number 8, Russian to protect the business. With the Cold War heating up in the mid-1980s, it was only natural that American wrestling promotions would start to push dastardly Russians as top heels. Of course, none of these Soviet-era baddies were actually born and raised in the USSR, but that didn't stop them from keeping up the act inside and outside the ring. Few went as far as Nikita Koloff, the Kayfabe nephew of Ivan Koloff, who was portrayed by Minnesota football prospect Nelson Scott Simpson. The so-called Russian nightmare not only learned to speak the mother tongue, but he also changed his name to Nikita Koloff in 1988. He refused to converse in English in public and feigned a lack of understanding in social situations, going so far as to hire an interpreter who helped him with tasks like finding an apartment. Sorry, did I mention that he legally changed his name to Nikita Koloff? I think it bears repeating. For someone who was brand new to the business and hadn't yet had the importance of kayfabe drilled into him, Koloff certainly went above and beyond to convince punters it was all real. Number 7, Samo and Silence cost the Hulkster. Being in character 24/7 is something that must come a lot easier to members of great wrestling families. After all, when so many members of your family's livelihoods depend on the business, you're damn sure going to do whatever is necessary to make sure that earning ability isn't compromised. Afa and Sika of the legendary Anawahi family were so intent on perpetuating the myth that they went to jail for it, and they took Hulk Hogan with them. The Wild Samoans were hitching a ride with the Hulkster during a trip to New Jersey when their car was pulled over by a state trooper. As Hogan went to retrieve his registration from the glove box, an unregistered handgun he had just purchased tumbled out. Bad news, brother, because possessing an unregistered handgun in New Jersey carried a mandatory 1-year sentence at the time. Rather than tell the cop that Hulk wasn't aware of the law, Afa and Sika simply stood in silence and allowed themselves to be handcuffed. See, despite obviously speaking perfect English, they played grunting savages on TV and decided it would be better to be carted to the local jailhouse than blow their cover. Number 6, a bad morning in Q8 for Vader. By April of 1997, the cat was very much out of the bag as far as whether or not people knew wrestling was in fact a work. Yet in the tradition of the likes of David Schultz before him, Vader, for whatever reason, felt that he had to uphold the integrity of the business while staying in character as a big bullying heel. The Mastodon and The Undertaker were appearing on the Good Morning Q8 TV show to promote WWE's ongoing tour of the country when the program's host, Basal Al-Othman, questioned the legitimacy of sports entertainment. Vader responded by flipping the table and grabbing a terrified Othman by his tie, asking the host if it felt fake while threatening to kick his ass. The former WCW World Heavyweight Champion was subsequently detained and placed under house arrest, admittedly in a posh hotel, for 10 days, with authorities upset at the foul language he had used on air as much as the would-be assault. Vader maintained afterwards that the whole scene had been suggested to him by the show's producers, who had failed to inform the host of their plan. Number 5, the Chics Silence. The original Sheik, not to be confused with the Iron Sheik, was a major draw in his prime, terrifying fans and repulsing viewers with his sadistic actions during countless blood-soaked brawls. With a forehead that looked as though it had lost a fight with a garden rake, the villainous Sheik scars were a reminder to fans that, hey, this stuff is real, you know? Shoot to name Ed Farhat, the Sheik not only suffered physically for his art, but he also did whatever he could away from the ring to stay in character. Since his character spoke Arabic, which was actually some incomprehensible nonsense that he spewed in the hope fans didn't know the difference, Farhat made sure to never speak English in public and travelled with his wife so that she could do the talking for him. Unless you were actual family or a close family friend, you would never hear him talk, something that he kept up until the day he died. Even when promoters would call the house to book him, if the Sheik happened to answer the phone, he would deny that anybody by the name of Ed lived there. Number 4, Mr. Wrestling saves wrestling. An October 4th, 1975 plane crash in Wilmington, North Carolina is widely known as what caused a young Ric Flair to sustain a broken neck, while Johnny Valentine was paralyzed never to wrestle again. Tim Woods, aka Mr. Wrestling, was also on that fateful flight, and despite suffering a concussion, bruised ribs, and a compression fracture in his back, his main worry was people finding out that wrestling wasn't real. You see, Woods was supposed to wrestle the villainous Valentine on that evening's show, and if people found out that they were traveling together and that a babyface was traveling with a group of heels, the jig would well and truly be up. So Woods lied to the authorities, telling them that he was in fact a promoter while giving them his civilian name of George Burrell Woodin. To dispel rumours that he had been on the plane, Woods even wrestled on a show just 2 weeks later, despite being in absolute agony. Flair would later write in his autobiography that Woods was more than just Mr. Wrestling that day, he was the man who saved wrestling. Number 3, Mr. Wrestling 2 turns down the president. Well, obviously there couldn't just be one Mr. Wrestling, could there? John Francis Walker, who had wrestled as Johnny Walker and the Grappler in the 1950s and 60s, came out of semi-retirement in the 70s to portray Mr. Wrestling 2, often teaming with the original. Exceptionally popular in the Georgia Championship Wrestling promotion, where he was a 10-time world champion, Mr. Wrestling 2 became a favourite of the state's governor, Jimmy Carter. So much so that Carter invited Walker to his inauguration after he became president in 1976. Walker would have gone too, on the condition that he could do so in his mask. Naturally, the Secret Service insisted that he take the hood off for security reasons, something that Walker wasn't prepared to do as it might jeopardize his career while he was in the middle of a big run. Walker thus had to turn down the president's invite. As an aside, that puts him in a class with late country music star Toby Keith, who had to say no to playing at a presidential dinner for George Bush because he had already been booked for NWA TNA's first ever show. Number 2, Masked for Life. In Mexican wrestling culture, the mask is sacred and luchadors will go to extreme lengths in order to hide their true identities from the public. Masks are also big business, with wrestlers receiving substantial payoffs when they lose them in matches. One wrestler who never lost his mask was the iconic El Santo, who managed to go decades without revealing his face. Santo, who was also a movie star, made it his mission to never be seen in public without his mask on, doing everything from eating lunch to traveling on planes while wearing his silver disguise. Of course, there were times when he would have to take the mask off, such as when he got off the plane and went through customs, but even then, Santo would make sure that whoever he was traveling with looked the other way when showing his face to Border Patrol. El Santo only showed his face very briefly on 3 occasions, pulling his mask up during talk show appearances after he had officially retired. Santo, whose real name was Rodolfo Guzman Huerta, passed away just 1 week after the last of these 3 instances at the age of 66. He was buried wearing his mask. Number 1. The Loose Cannon. Toward the end of 1995, the high-flying, once clean-cut Brian Pillman morphed into the wild and unpredictable Loose Cannon. Pillman not only changed up his look and wrestling style, but he also began acting erratically in front of the camera, just ask Bobby Heenan, as well as backstage and even away from the arena. Brian was so out there that his colleagues and friends didn't know where the line was and began to fear for his mental stability. This included his former Hollywood Blondes tag partner Steve Austin, who later revealed that Pillman would remain in character whenever the two spoke and never let on whether he was working or shooting despite their closeness. The ex-Horseman was so committed to getting his character over that he helped engineer a situation where Eric Bischoff legitimately let him out of his WCW contract so that he could go to ECW and develop his persona further before returning, something that never happened as Pillman signed with WWE instead. The Loose Cannon was, for a time, the talk of the wrestling industry, leaving fans, promoters, and wrestlers alike equal parts puzzled and awed at Pillman's dedication to his persona and always being in character right up until the end.